Hello everyone. So very sorry first of all that I'm not here for this remote lesson. However, I will be there for the next one. So this is just a one-off thing, but we're going to be going through the rest of variables, and we're going to be doing a little bit of a recap on what we did in class when we started variables. I'm going to be asking you to pause this video and get on with some activities and things like that. But let me just quickly show you what you're going to need for this particular lesson. We're going to finish going through variables, so this PowerPoint you can actually find on Google Classroom in the classwork section, but then we're also going to move on to ethics and types of data. So for this particular lesson, you will see in the classwork section that I have two booklets, a types of data worksheet booklet and also an ethics worksheet booklet. So you will need these a little bit later on in the lesson, but for now we'll continue with variables. So if you have a look then at operationalizing variables, we just went over this in the last lesson. So we talked about how operationalizing a variable means to define a variable. So defining both the IV, the independent variable, and the DV, the dependent variable as well. So just like the example that we went through in class, we could define, say for example, noise levels as very loud at 50 decibels or very quiet at, say for example, 0 decibels or silent. And then how would we be able to define memory? We could do, say for example, a memory test out of 20. So the way in which we define a variable, whether that be an IV or a DV, is how it is operationalized, and we did go through that in class. So what we're going to do then is we are going to have a look at a different type of variable. Now I'll just make this full screen. So the next type of variable we need to learn about, other than IVs and DVs, is extraneous variables. Now an extraneous variable is a variable that could affect the results of the study. And I stress the word could because an extraneous variable is just kind of a possibility variable, something that could affect the results of your study. When an extraneous variable actually does affect the results, it becomes something else, and that's called a confounding variable. Now again, I'll give you some examples of what I mean by this so that it makes it a little bit more clear. But an extraneous variable, say for example we are doing a study on noise levels and memory. So we get one group of people, we put them in a noisy room of 50 decibels where there's music playing out quite loud. Then we get another group of people, we put them in a silent room, and then we test their memory afterwards. Now, other than noise levels, is there anything else that could affect their memory? It could be things like their age, whether they ate in the morning, if they had caffeine the night before. All of those would be considered extraneous variables because they are variables that could have affected their memory rather than just the noise levels in the room. If one of them did affect their memory, so say for example somebody says they've got a bad memory because they're very, very old, then that becomes therefore a confounding variable. Again, I'll give you some more examples so that it can make a little bit more sense. So it says here, applying experimental control. Basically, control is really, really important in experiments in order to ensure that your IV is actually having an effect on the DV. And that's what we always aim for in experiments, is that we always want a cause and effect relationship. A cause and effect relationship is whether or not the change that we have made in the IV has caused the result of the DV. So we're always looking for a cause and effect relationship in experiments, and control is really, really important in experiments, to control any extraneous variables to ensure that it's only the IV that's affecting the DV. Psychologists try to control extraneous variables, so those are possible variables that could affect the DV or the results, so that they don't become confounding. So here's an example. If, say for example, our independent variable was caffeine and we wanted to have a look at its effect on, say for example, memory or the number of words recalled, we'd give, say for example, one group of participants some caffeine to drink and the other group of participants no caffeine to drink. And then we would measure their memory and we'd measure that through the number of words recalled out of 20. Now, possible extraneous variables, things that could affect their memory other than just the caffeine, could be things like the time of day, because the time of day makes a difference in how good your memory is, whether they've had tea and coffee. So say, imagine they were in the non-caffeine group, but when they woke up they had 2 cups of coffee and then they came to the experiment, they've already had caffeine beforehand. So them drinking in the morning could be an extraneous variable that could affect, again, their memory. And then noise, if there's any noise in the room, that could affect their memory as well. So what do? We try to control these different things. And how would we do that? We'd say, for example, example, for the time of day, we try and control it by getting them all tested at 9 a.m, making sure we're not testing some of them at 9, some of them at 12, some of them at 5 in the evening. So we'd make sure we all tested those participants at the same time of day. Then for this extraneous variable of whether they drank tea or coffee beforehand, because we want to make sure that only some of them are drinking caffeine and the others are not, what we do is we say to them, please don't drink any caffeine for 12 hours. So that's the way we could control that extraneous variable from becoming a confounding variable. And then when it comes to noise, we could make sure that they were all tested in the same room or a quiet room was used, just to make sure that noise wasn't an influencing factor when it came to this experiment. So we have a couple of things here now. Some of these are very important keywords, and you might have to write this down as well in your notes that you're working on Monday. So we've got things like temperature. So these are potential things that could affect your study. Temperature, body language, so potential variables that could affect your study. Participant reactivity, so how reactive they are. The time of day, the age, the tone of voice, personality, intelligence, bias. And then we've got these two really important words. We've got the word demand characteristics and the word order effects. Now, demand characteristics basically means if your participants find out the aim of your study, they may basically act in a way to help or hinder the researcher. So this is a really, really important keyword. So please do write down what I'm saying right now. If you want to pause, you can do, or replay, kind of rewind a little bit and replay what I'm saying. But a demand characteristic is a type of extraneous variable that could become a confounding variable and affect your results. If, say, for example, a person found out what the aim of your study was. So let's go back to the example about caffeine. So say we're doing a study on caffeine and whether that affects memory. If somebody knew that that's what the aim of the experiment was and they were in the caffeine group and drank 2 cans of Coke, which the experiment gives them, then they may purposely change how much they remember, in terms of, like, they may write down not everything just because they think that that might screw up basically the researcher's work or the researcher's results. So a demand characteristic, this is the actual definition. When your study suffers from demand characteristics, or when your participants show demand characteristics, this is when they have found out the aim of the study and change their behavior to help or hinder the researcher. So you can rewind what I've just said, but it's when a participant finds out the aim of the study and then changes their behavior in order to help or hinder the researcher. So a very, very important extraneous variable that we need to know about is demand characteristics. Another that is really important is order effects. Now, order effects is basically if the participant is bored, tired, or has some sort of practice in the study, then that could also change their results. For example, imagine you went to a study and the study lasted 3 hours. Your performance at the beginning of the study would probably be different to the performance at the end of the 3 hours, because you might get tired, you might get bored, or you might have had so much practice with what you're doing anyway, you might get better at it towards the end. So an order effect is if you are fatigued or tired, if you are bored, or if you've had some sort of practice with whatever the person is testing, then that could also influence the results. So it's not the IV, it's not the caffeine that's affecting it, but it's basically whether you're bored, tired, or you've already had a practice at this particular type of test. That could affect whether or not you get a good result or what your result actually is. So if we were going to split this into types of extraneous variable, there are 3 types of extraneous variable. Participant variables, it's a type of extraneous variable, so something that could affect the researcher's results. Situational variables and researcher variables. So participant variables include things like personality, age, intelligence, the participant reactivity. So a person's age might be an extraneous variable that affects memory, when really what you want to test is whether caffeine affects memory and not whether age affects memory. But depending on how old they are, it may be that that might affect the results. Situational variables include things like temperature, so temperature of the room, temperature outside, the weather, time of day. Order effects, as I've mentioned, so boredom, fatigue, practice. Demand characteristics as well, so if they find out the aim of the study, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But these ones are a lot easier to control because temperature you can control by putting on AC in the room or heater or something. Time of day you can tell them all to come in at 9 o'clock. Order effects, you can try and make sure the study's not too long or that they haven't had practice with this type of test before. And demand characteristics, you could usually control for that by not telling them the aim of the study beforehand, so deceiving your participants. And then we have researcher variables that could also be an extraneous variable. For example, body language of the researcher, tone of voice, personality and biases and age of the researcher. So imagine you go into an experiment and the researcher that you are going into this experiment for isn't very nice to you. You may then change the way that you act in that study because of the researcher, and again that might affect your results, so that's a potential extraneous variable too. So, ways that you could control for participant variables then. Now, we're not going to actually look through this until we actually have learned all of these keywords, which is a couple of lessons down the line. So I am going to leave them in the PowerPoint for now. But if you want to have a read through, you're free to. But we will talk and come back to this when we've learned about all of these different keywords like experimental design, experimental method, etc. and so on. So there is some exam practice here, and you can see it says a researcher has conducted an independent measures design. Now you don't know what that is yet, so don't worry. So a researcher has conducted an experiment to investigate whether chewing gum influences concentration. So chewing gum influences concentration. She recorded how many changes were detected in a spot the difference puzzle by people chewing gum when completing the task compared to those people who are not chewing gum. The results are in the table below. You don't have to look for the table below, but here are some questions, for example, that you could get based on IVs and DVs. So it says identify the independent variable and the dependent variable in this experiment, 2 marks. So if you look at this experiment, you've got to find where the IV is and what the IV is and what the DV is. So the experiment is whether chewing gum affects or influences concentration. So what is our IV here? Chewing gum would probably be our IV, because that's the thing that the research is changing. You'll probably have one group chewing gum and one group not chewing gum, and that's what it says right here. And then his DV is concentration measured by the amount of changes spotted in a spot the difference puzzle. So for this question you would put the IV is chewing gum, whether participants chewed gum or didn't chew gum, and the DV or the dependent variable is concentration measured by the amount of changes detected in a spot the difference puzzle. You would need to make sure you are operationalizing your IV and DV when you are telling me what the IV and DV is. So making sure you've defined the groups for the IV and making sure that you've made it measurable when it comes to the DV. The second question says, describe an alternative way to operationalize the dependent variable in this experiment. Now this is quite a difficult one. It's basically saying how else could you measure concentration? So they've measured it by the differences spotted in a spot the difference puzzle, the amount of differences detected in a spot the difference. How else could you measure concentration? You've got to think about it. So you could say, for example, an alternative way to operationalize the DV of concentration could be, and then you've got to think about a way that you could measure concentration. You could say by giving participants a jigsaw puzzle to do and seeing how long in minutes it takes them to complete the jigsaw puzzle. This could be a way to measure concentration. So you've basically got to make sure you've got a measurable DV and that it's actually measuring concentration. You couldn't say, oh, we'll give them a test and ask them how concentrated they are, you know, because that doesn't really make sense, but it'd have to be an actual task for concentration. So I've said do a jigsaw puzzle and time it in seconds or minutes of how long it takes them to do that. So you could possibly say that. So there's a couple of questions here. Now what I would say is leave these questions until we've gone through the other 2 topics, and then if you've got some time at the end, please have a go at completing some of these questions. So let's move on to our next topic, which is types of data. Okay, so again, this PowerPoint will be on Google Classroom. It'll probably be in the classwork section, so you can access it if you know, if you want to make that a little bit easier for yourself. You also need to have this worksheet up on your desktop, okay, while you watch this video, and you need to be filling this in as we go along, okay. So you can see it has a couple of activities in there, some exam questions towards the end, some boxes for you to fill in as we go through the PowerPoint. So this particular booklet for types of data needs to be open whilst you watch this video. So our learning objectives for types of data is to be able to demonstrate an understanding of the different types of data in psychology and where they are appropriate. So we'll look at the two different types of data to begin with, which are quantitative data and qualitative data. Now this is one of the most basic topics in psychology, so if you are struggling with this, please do let me know when you next see me on Monday. So quantitative data is basically data collected that is numerical data. It is statistical data, it can be measured, and it usually includes numbers, measurements, percentages, means, modes, medians, things like that. Qualitative data, on the other hand, is the complete opposite. So it is descriptive data, it's information that's not in numerical form, it may be in the form of thoughts and comments or descriptions. And a good way to remember these is quantitative has an N in it, and an N stands for numbers. Qualitative has an L in it, and L stands for language. Oh, can you actually see this? Quantitative data, I'll give you an example. Quantitative data could be things like the scores on a memory test, because that's numerical, or it could be your height, your weight. It could be, the number of changes detected in a spot the difference puzzle, that sort of thing. Qualitative data, on the other hand, could be your attitude towards domestic violence. So actually giving me your full thoughts about domestic violence. Or say, for example, it could be things like your attitudes towards education. You could be telling me how you feel about education and what you think is good about education and bad about education. So you're actually describing your feelings or your thoughts to me rather than me trying to quantify that in a number. So here is some important terminology for you. We've got quantitative data, objective numerical data expressed in the form of numbers, such as scores on a memory test. Qualitative data is in-depth descriptive data which is expressed in words or images, such as the diary of someone with a mental disorder. That would be considered qualitative. Then we have two other types of data, primary and secondary. Primary data is basically data collected by a researcher for the purpose of the study currently being undertaken. For example, notes from an observation, while they're watching someone, help somebody else, they're writing down what that person is doing. So primary data is data collected by the researcher themselves and not taken from any secondary source like a newspaper or something. Secondary data, on the other hand, is data which is already in existence. So you haven't collected this data yourself. It has been collected for a different purpose and now you're using it in your study. For example, government crime statistics. If you say, for example, wanted to do a study on the differences between males and females and how much crime they commit, then you have a look at the government's crime statistics for males and the government's crime statistics for females. That would be considered secondary data, and that's because you didn't collect that information yourself. It was already available on the internet somewhere. Whereas, say, for example, you did something like, I want to see the difference between shopping behaviour in Asda and Poundland, then you could go out and you could observe people in Asda, you could observe people in Poundland, and you could write down, how they behaved yourself. That would be considered primary because you are collecting that data yourself. So, a little kind of, not a game, but it says stand under the relevant term. Obviously this is remote, so you won't be able to do that. But what type of data are these scenarios? So the first one says the percentage of students, I should say, who a researcher sees acting aggressively. So the percentage of students who a researcher sees as acting aggressively. Now, first of all, because it's percentage, we know that it was definitely quantitative, because quantitative data is numerical and a percentage is numerical. Now, it says here who a researcher sees acting aggressively. So the researcher is looking at this firsthand, which would make it primary as well. So it is both primary and quantitative. Photographs taken through a one-way mirror to study curiosity. So photographs taken through a one-way mirror to study curiosity. Now a photograph isn't numerical, so we'd say that's probably qualitative data. And if you're the one taking the photograph, we'd consider it primary as well. So this again is both. The number of drug-related hospital admissions in Lancashire. So drug-related, the number. So because it says number, we know it's quantitative. Drug-related hospital admissions in Lancashire. Now you haven't collected that yourself. That information's already there as a statistic available to you, so it would be considered secondary. So you can see where this is going. All of them have their type of data underneath. So this one, studying how often violent language is used on social media posts from 2016. Now, they've already been posted in 2016. It's 2020, so that's secondary data. And how often, so that usually means how often, meaning how many times, it would be quantitative. The psychiatrist asks his patient to keep a diary of his experiences. So here, psychiatrist asking his patient to keep a diary. It would be primary because he is keeping a diary of his own thoughts and feelings, and because it's his thoughts and feelings, it would be considered qualitative as well. Then we've got studying the instances of inherited mental health disorders using an adoption registry. Again, quantitative because it's the instances, number of times, how often, all of that relates to numbers. All of that relates to quantitative data. And then we've got of mental health disorders using an adoption registry. So now again, you haven't collected that yourself because you've got it from a registry, and therefore it'd be considered secondary data. So have a quick read through, see if you understand why this would be considered qualitative and why it would be considered primary. You can pause the video and see if you can actually explain that. Similarly, it would be the same for the next one as well. And there we go. So there are some exam questions here. Again, I'm not going to go through these exam questions. As I said, if you have time at the end, after you've been through all of these different booklets, filled in all of the relevant sections, then you can come back to these exam questions and complete those as well. But we've got things like outline what is meant by qualitative data. So you've got to tell me what qualitative data is. Qualitative data, so for example, qualitative data is data that is in the form of descriptions, thoughts and feelings. This can include things like a person's description of how they feel, something like that. So tell me what it is and give me a small example for 2 marks. So what I'd like you to do is in your booklets, so let me just get out of here, in your data booklets, you'll see it says operationalize the following variables to collect quantitative and qualitative data. And it's the same here in the PowerPoint. Operationalize the following variables as qualitative or quantitative. So there's a number of different variables here. These are all DVs, okay? So attitude to education is a DV, driving ability is a DV. How would you measure that DV in a qualitative and quantitative way? So if I did attitude to education with you guys, and then you have a go and pause the video and do the rest. So we've got attitude to education, a quantitative suggestion. How would you measure that? We could say, give participants questionnaire on attitudes to education and ask them to rate their attitude on a scale of 1 to 10 about how they feel about different education related questions. Now that is definitely quantitative because they're giving a rating, so they're giving a number, so you have some sort of numerical statistic. A qualitative suggestion could be ask participants to describe their feelings about education, asking them different questions relating to education and asking them to describe how they feel about certain topics within education. So I'll leave this one in the booklet for you guys. But this is what you are doing, so you're going to try and operationalize how would we measure driving ability in a quantitative way and driving ability in a qualitative way. So again, it could be driving ability in a quantitative way could be get them to drive for 20 minutes and see how many mistakes they would make. So the amount of mistakes would be how you'd quantitatively measure driving ability. Qualitatively, how would you measure driving ability? You would ask them how they feel about driving, whether they feel stressed or if they've ever had an accident in the past and things like that to measure their driving ability. Now I want you guys to have a go at all of these and see if you can find a way to measure it quantitative and a way to measure it qualitatively. So pause the video, have a go at all of these, and then we'll move on to the next bit. Okay, so once you've done that activity, we're moving on to the next one, which is looking at the strengths and the weaknesses of primary and secondary data and qualitative and quantitative data. So you'll see at the end of that activity, you also have a page to fill in the evaluation table. So this is you looking at the pros and cons basically of primary and secondary data, quantitative and qualitative data. So you should be filling this in as we go through the strengths and weaknesses together. So we've got a weakness for primary data is that it's more costly and time consuming as researchers have to collect the data firsthand. So when it comes to primary data, because you are collecting it yourself, it's going to take a lot more time rather than just getting it out of a book somewhere, the information, or a website with statistics and things like that. So it is more costly and it is more time consuming. For secondary data, we have a strength here. So we have it's time effective and therefore also saves cost, as data is second hand, so it already exists. You don't have to collect it yourself. It's also very useful because it could be impractical or unethical to gather it first hand. For example, if you wanted to look at things like the study of drug use in those who are admitted to mental health wards, how would you collect that first hand yourself? You won't say, okay, so I'm going to give you some drugs and I'm not going to give you any, and we're going to see how it works out with your mental health after that. Like, you won't be able to do that. So having that information already at hand is really, really useful, and that's why secondary data is one of their strengths, is having that data already there, so you don't have to actually do it yourself. Weaknesses, however, of secondary data is that it might not be a useful demographic. What that means is the participants you're looking for might not be the participants you really want to look at, so they might not fit the exact researcher requirements. Data could be outdated as well, and we also have that researchers may not be certain of the extent to which secondary data is valid and reliable. So, for example, you could go onto our website and find some statistics, but how do you know that those statistics are truthful statistics, they're reliable and valid statistics, they're not biased statistics, and things such as that. So again, you can pause this video and you can write these down or copy these down into your booklet. We also have a strength of primary, so there's one missing here. Now, I'd like you to have a think about what do you think a strength of primary data would be. Now, although it's more costly and time consuming, as researchers have to collect the data firsthand, a strength could possibly be something like, and I would like you to write this down in your booklets, a strength could possibly be something like you are able to check the validity of the information that you are collecting. You may be able to also get certain participants for your experiment that may not have been available in secondary data. So, for example, if you want to look at, the playground behaviour of 3 to 7 years olds, there may not be something with that information in a booklet, and therefore you going out and searching for those participants yourself and seeing the data yourself, you may be able to get a lot more information, and because you're doing it firsthand as well, you're able to check the validity of what it is that you've looked at. So you can write that down. If you want to rewind this, you can do, and write something like that down in the strengths for primary data. Then we have the strengths and weaknesses of qualitative and quantitative data. So for strengths for quantitative, which is the numerical data, we have it's easy to analyze and compare, as you can calculate statistics for each condition or depict this information in a graph. So the best thing about quantitative data is that because you can have it in numerical form, you can really, really see the differences between groups so easily. So for example, if I was doing the differences between gender and memory, and I had some females in one group, males in another group, and I did a memory test, I could say, oh, the females got an average score of 50 out of 50 and the males got an average score of 10 out of 50. So it really shows me easily the difference between males and females and their memory scores, and I could also put that in a graph very, very easily to be able to see those differences as well. Another strength could be objective data. Objective data basically means it's data that you can't actually argue with and it's not open to interpretation. So objective data for quantitative results is really, really important because you can actually base conclusion on statistical analysis that you've done. You can carry out means, medians, modes, ranges and things like that on quantitative data because it's in numerical form, and therefore you can't, like, if somebody found 3 differences in a spot the difference puzzle, you won't say, oh well, they found 3, that means they found 7. Like, there's no way of doing that. It's objective. It means it is what it is. You've got to kind of go with their result, and there's no way of interpreting it in a different way. And it's also more likely to be reliable, as numerical data is more likely to be consistent. So if they did spot the differences puzzle one day, then the same one the next day, they may find the exact same differences. So that makes it usually more reliable and consistent. Weaknesses, however, include that it doesn't allow for detailed insight or reasons for behaviour. Because you're just getting a score, you don't actually know the reasons behind that. So it may be that the females got better memory scores, but we don't know why because we haven't asked them any questions. We haven't collected any qualitative data from them. Also, quantifying certain concepts may be oversimplistic. So say for example, if we wanted to look at attitudes to education and we said rate your attitude to education on a scale of 1 to 10 and they said 7, we wouldn't actually know why that is, what their attitude to education actually was, any sort of detailed insight into that. So it's quite overly simplistic having just quantitative data. Now for qualitative data, the strengths and weaknesses are basically the opposite to quantitative. So the strength is that it's high in validity as it provides rich and detailed insight into the reasons for behaviour, but the weaknesses include it's difficult to analyse. So rather than being easy to analyse with quantitative, it's more difficult to analyse and quite time consuming because everybody could have a different opinion. How would you then compare that? So it's quite difficult to compare across groups as well. It says it could be subject to biased or subjective interpretation. Again, if you said to somebody, tell me about your attitude towards education, you ask 3 different people and they give you 3 different results, you could interpret what they've said in a different way. So they might say, well, I find education to be good at times, but then I also find it to be quite tedious. You could be like, oh, okay, so what they mean by that is that because they've said it's quite tedious, is that they don't actually enjoy education, they've had a bad experience with it in their childhood. You could interpret their information that they've given you in a different way, and that makes the information less valid and probably less reliable as well. So yeah, please could you copy these down into your booklets, and that is the end of quantitative and qualitative primary and secondary data. Again, there's exam practice, so there's quite a bit of exam practice at the end. Now I would say to leave the exam practice, do have a read through these slides, so please do pause this video and have a read through, but we will go through this in class when I see you on Monday. Okay. So our next topic that you need to open up is the research ethics worksheet, and this is what it looks like. We're going to be going through ethics in psychology, and these are the terms that you should know by the end of today's session. BPS, ethics, responsibility, respect, debrief, informed consent, competence, integrity, confidentiality, deception, right to withdraw, and protection from harm. And there are a couple of activities for you to be filling in as we go through the PowerPoint. So if you could fill all of these in as we go through, that would be highly appreciated. So let's start with our ethics PowerPoint. So ethics are basically a system of morals and rules on how to behave. It considers what actions are right and wrong in particular circumstances, and ethics in general can vary across time and cultures due to attitudes of that society. Ethics are basically rules or morals, things that you need to follow. Why do we actually need them in psychology then? Human beings are living creatures that can experience pain, fear, discomfort, embarrassment, etc. And we're also thinking creatures that, could feel things like jealousy and guilt. Now, research may involve subjecting participants to pain or embarrassment, and therefore we need some guidelines in place to try and protect them from any negative effects of harm. What actually are ethical guidelines then? So we've got in psychology, they're basically the set of rules which researchers must follow in order to protect their participants when they're conducting research. These are made up by the British Psychological Society, the BPS. And all research proposals must go through an ethics committee before they are actually allowed to take part in their, allowed to start their study basically. So before anything's carried out, they go to an ethics committee and give their research proposal to the ethics committee for that to be accepted. Now, if any of you went to do psychology at university, in your dissertation, you'd have to do a big experiment, and you have to actually give your experiment proposal to, say for example, your tutor for them to then accept whether or not your experiment can go ahead. If it has any chance of harm to your participants and things like that, they usually say no. So the British Psychological Society's ethical guidelines also draw attention to treatment of vulnerable participants, for example, people that need extra safeguarding, children, people with mental disorders, the elderly, etc. And the guidelines also state that no person should be forced into participating in this research. You can't actually force anybody. Now, why do we break ethical guidelines sometimes? It says here we need to strike the balance. So the fundamental ethical question in psychological research is, does the end justify the means? Basically, what we've been through in the experiment, does the end result justify how we've actually got there? A balance must be struck between the interests of the participants and the value of the research. This is called a cost-benefit analysis. This says add this to your glossary. Just make a note of this somewhere. So a cost-benefit analysis is whether or not a balance is struck between the interests of the participants and the value of the research. So you're thinking of the pros and cons of how you should treat your participants and whether that will benefit the research in any way. So we have 6 ethical issues and 4 guidelines. Now, you are going to be writing down what these ethical issues are, and you're also going to be writing down the 4 guidelines and what they stand for. So if you have a look in your ethics worksheet, it says when we go through informed consent, the ethical issue, you're going to describe what it is, and then the ethical guidelines that it actually falls under, you're going to pop in this section and tell me what that means. So if you have a look at the PowerPoint, you can see respect is one of the guidelines, which means we need to respect our participants. We need to make sure that they feel respected in the study. And the way that we do that is through these ethical issues of informed consent, confidentiality, and giving them the right to withdraw, which I'll go through in a minute. So those 3 fall under the respect guideline. Deception falls under the integrity guideline. Debriefing and protection from harm falls under the responsibility guideline, and then competence is a guideline of its own. It's basically one that encompasses all of them. Now, a good way to remember all of the ethical issues is this: can do, can't do with participants, consent, deception, confidentiality, debrief, withdraw, and protection from harm. Now let's go through the guidelines and then we'll go through the different ethical issues. So the guideline of respect is basically valuing the dignity and worth of all individuals. This includes awareness of how psychologists may influence people and appear to have authority, and of people's rights as well to privacy and self-determination. So when you are writing down what the meaning of these 6 ethical issues are and which guideline they fall under, I'd like you in your booklet to write down what that particular guideline also means. So if, say for example, we have something that falls under respect, such as the right to withdraw, which falls under respect, when you find out what right to withdraw means, you can write in at the description of right to withdraw here, and then you can write that it falls under the ethical guideline of respect, and tell me what respect means. Obviously, respect works for not just right to withdraw, but a couple of others as well. You don't have to keep writing it down. Once you've wrote it once, you can just put the word respect in that box rather than writing the full description. So you can pause this video as we go through and make sure you are writing those things in those boxes. So responsibility is the next ethical guideline we have, which is valuing the responsibilities of being a psychologist to clients, the public, and the profession of science and psychology. This includes the avoidance of harm and the prevention of misuse or abuse of one's contributions to society. Then we have integrity. So integrity is basically deception, which we'll talk about in a minute, valuing honesty, accuracy, clarity, and the fairness in interactions, and seeking to promote these in a scientific and professional way. So that is to do with one of the ethical issues as well. And then competence basically underlies everything, and it's valuing continuing development as a psychologist and the maintenance of high standards of work. This includes functioning optimally and within the limits of one's own knowledge, skill, training, experience, and education. So these 4 ethical guidelines have a number of ethical issues within them, as you can see here. We'll go through the ethical issues. They're very, very important to know, and we'll start with informed consent. So you do need to be writing this in your booklet. Informed consent is basically the British Psychological Guidelines state no research on a person may be carried out without the informed, free, express, specific, and documented consent of that person. This places the legal obligation of researchers to obtain and record consent from participants or their guardians on the basis of information such as the aim that should be given to them before the participant begins or before the participation begins. Basically, informed consent is making sure that you have some sort of signed documentation before your study goes ahead, telling the participant what they are basically in for. So what they are going to be expecting in your study, what the aim of your study is, why you are doing this research, and where that information will go. And you usually get some sort of consent form for them to fill in. Confidentiality is the next one. We've got participants must be assured that all information they give will be treated with the utmost confidentiality and that their anonymity will be respected at all times. So, and this is covered by data protection. When I'm asking you to write this in your booklets, your workbooks, please put it in your own words. Don't just copy and paste from the PowerPoint, because there's no point. I want you to put it in your own words. But confidentiality is basically making sure your participants are kept, their data is kept confidential. So usually that's done by not taking participants' names down, for example, or giving them the alternative names like participant 1, participant 2, participant A, participant B, or just taking their initials, just so that they're not able to be identified if the research was to be published. The next one we have is debriefing. Debriefing is basically once the participants are no longer required for research, they must be fully debriefed and told about any deception as well. So any way that they were lied to or deceived in the study needs to be explained. The aims of the research and how participants' data will be used must also be explained and relevant support offered. So a debrief usually happens if you haven't given informed consent before the study. Some researchers don't like to give informed consent, and this is because they feel like their study might suffer from demand characteristics. If they tell the aim of the study, their participants might change their behaviour, and that might affect the results. That makes their study less valid. So what they do is they debrief them at the end instead, which is they tell them the aim, what they've just taken part in, and then give them specific numbers. So for example, if you need to speak to anyone or if you want to contact me further, they'll give their contact details, and they explain where their research will go as well. Then we have the right to withdraw. This is kind of what it says on the tin, which is participants must be given the right to withdraw at any time of the experiment, at any time of the research, without any penalties or without providing reason. Participants can also require that their data be withdrawn from the study if they wish to at the end of the study. So if someone wants to leave the study, they should be able to at any time, and that's what the right to withdraw is. Then we have protection from harm, and this is really, really important. It's basically all researchers are obliged to protect their participants from possible harm, to preserve their dignity and their rights, and to safeguard their anonymity and confidentiality. This means basically researchers are fully responsible for their participants' welfare, their physical and psychological well-being, and whilst they are part of the research project, that is. Researchers must also consider any ongoing long-term effects that might affect the participant. So protection from harm encompasses everything. It's things like embarrassment, jealousy, guilt that they might feel after the study, any physical harm they may get, any emotional or mental harm they may feel from the study. They need to make sure they are protected from that while they are within the research. Sometimes what they tend to do is, in the debriefing, they will give them specific numbers to Samaritans, for example, mental health hotlines, etc. and so on, if they do feel like they've suffered from any long-term effects. So they do give them things in the debrief in case, just in case they are, feeling some sort of embarrassment or guilt after the study's gone ahead. And the last one is deception. So that's participants should not be misled about the aims or the nature of the research by providing false aims or their role as a participant. So basically, when you do a study, you can't kind of lie to your participants. Deception usually happens quite a bit in psychological studies, and that's because researchers try to deceive their participants, because if the participant finds out the aim of the study, they're not going to show truthful behaviour, or they may kind of help or hinder the researcher and show demand characteristics. So deception is sometimes justified. And remember, I've said that the aim of ethics, or the kind of overall goal of ethics, the question for it is, does the end justify the means? So does what we get at the end justify the way that we got there? So us lying to our participants, for example, or taking away that informed consent and not getting informed consent, does the end result that we got justify the fact that we basically broke those ethical issues? So we've got to think about that. So there's a couple of scenarios here. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to have a look at the scenario. So for example, this one says a researcher conducts observations on public transport systems in London. He poses as a businessman on his way to and from work, and covertly means secretly, observes chivalrous behaviour such as men offering their seats to women. Is there any ethical issues that you think may be kind of a problem here? So we've got here, it says informed consent may be an issue, but actually informed consent isn't needed if you're in a public place, and a train is considered a public place, so you don't actually have to get informed consent every time. You don't have to get a signed copy or anything every time, especially if you're in public. Deception, the researcher is pretending to be someone he's not, so he is deceiving the participants. Withdrawal, it's not actually possible if they don't know they're participating. How are they going to be given the right to withdraw? And then protection, confidentiality and debriefing are not major problems here, because again, they're in a public place, they don't really have to be debriefed. They don't actually have to be protected from any harm, because I don't think that there's any harm coming to them, because they don't even know they're part of the study, because they're only being observed. And confidentiality is not a problem, because again, they're in a public place and the researcher doesn't know kind of everyone's names on that train or anything like that. So there's a couple of scenarios here I want you to have a read through. So I'm just going to ask you to pause the video, have a read through, think about what sorts of ethical issues may be present here, and then you can have a look at the answers on the next slide. So keep pausing and playing as I go through this PowerPoint.
You've got this at a bar, so,
Okay, so moving on. Moving on, you've got another bit to fill in your booklets, and that is the ethical issue or consideration, informed consent, confidentiality, right to withdraw, debrief, protection from harm, and deception. Why is it important to address this issue? So why is it important to have informed consent? I want you to have a think about it and pop that in there. How would a psychologist avoid breaking this consideration? Well, by actually giving them something to sign. And why might a psychologist actually break this consideration when they're doing a study? And it may be to avoid demand characteristics. So we'll go through it in the PowerPoint. We'll have a quick look, but I want you to be filling in your workbook with things that you think why it's important. Why do you think a psychologist might break this particular ethical issue, and why do you think or how do you think they could avoid it? So a couple of lines first of all. So do pause this video. A couple of lines answering all of these questions in each of the boxes, and then we'll have a look at the answers on the PowerPoint as well. So if you could pause, put your own thoughts, and then leave a little bit of space for the stuff that we've got here, and I want you to copy that into your booklets after we've gone through it as well. Okay, so after you've done that, after you've put in kind of your own thoughts, here we go. So you've got, why is it important to address informed consent? Otherwise, participants will not be aware of what they've agreed to, so they could experience harm. How would a psychologist avoid breaking this consideration? They could remove deception, for example. So how would they avoid breaking this? So, for example, only deceive the participants if completely necessary for the study. Inform them of their true aim. That's how they could, avoid breaking this consideration. Ask for parental consent if they're under 16. Conduct observations in public places. They won't have to get informed consent that way. Or why might they actually break this consideration? We've got to gather more authentic behaviour, to prevent demand characteristics, as I said, so them finding out the aim. Or if they're observing in a public place, they might break this consideration because they don't actually need it in a public place. Then we've got, again, why is it important to address the issue of confidentiality? If it is a person's right to be confidentiality, a person has a right to confidentiality and privacy. It may cause them distress or embarrassment if they took their names down. They may lose trust in psychological research. How would you avoid breaking this? By keeping their data a secret, basically, or keeping it confidential in accordance with the Data Protection Act, using code names such as Participant 101 so it's anonymous. And why might you actually break this? There isn't really a reason why you should break this one. Only if a person presents to be in danger to themselves or others, that's when you can take their name, but that's all. Why is it important to address the issue of right to withdraw? People might feel obligated to continue. They should never feel like that. And if they feel like they can't withdraw, they may experience harm. They may explain how would you avoid breaking this consideration. You explain to them before the study that can leave at any time without any penalties, and that they could remove their results at any time as well. And why might you break this? Because researchers may not give the right to withdraw if they feel that mimics is important for behaviour that they are studying. Basically, they might not give somebody the right to withdraw because they feel like the participant they've got at that time is really important to the study of this behaviour. So say, for example, it was a mental health patient and you were looking at something in mental health, you might find that this participant's really, really interesting and you really want to study them, so you might not give them the right to withdraw. Then we have the others. So again, you should have paused the video and put these notes down in your booklets. Then we have, why is it important to address the issue of debriefing? Because it may cause long-lasting psychological harm. You need to make sure that you have left the participants in the same way that they started the experiment. How might you avoid breaking it? Explain at the end of the study the purpose of the study. Talk about negative impacts. Give them numbers. Give them contact details. Why might you break it? You should actually always have a debrief. So you might break it because you've given them informed consent, but even when you've given informed consent, you should still try and have a debrief. The only time you don't have a debrief is if you're in a public place. Why is it important to address the issue of protection from harm? Because again, they should leave the study the same state they've entered it. It may be damaging to the reputation of psychology if the research causes undue harm. How might a psychologist avoid breaking this consideration? Making sure the task that they do is nothing that they wouldn't do in real life anyway. So that's really, really important for protection from harm. You need to make sure as a researcher the task your participants doing is similar to tasks that they would do in real life, or the harm that they may experience doing a certain task in your study is same as the potential risks and harms that they may face in real life if they were doing the same task. You need to also make sure that you give some sort of contact details in the debrief to try and make sure there's no long-term harm. Why might you break this consideration? Sometimes you expose participants to things that would harm them in order to investigate extreme behaviours. Again, why is it important to address the issue of deception? Participants will not be able to give informed consent and therefore will not know what they've agreed to take part in. So it's really important to make sure you're not deceiving your participants. How might you avoid breaking it? Do not provide a false aim at the beginning. And why might you break it? To reduce demand characteristics. So again, pause this video and put this in your notes, please. Then we also have some exam questions. Now, we have smaller exam questions like identify 2 ethical issues that would need to be considered when carrying out this observation. So they've got an observation here. Remember, covert means undercover observation, so people don't know they're being studied. So what sort of ethical issues would you need to consider when carrying out this observation? I'd like you to have a go at some of the exam questions if you could. So there are some here. You can see there are plenty in the booklets. If it's taking you the full 3 hours to go through all 3 of these topics and to fill in all the notes, then you can leave the exam questions out. But the more exam practice you do, the better it is going to be for you. So I am going to stop this video now. I'm going to give you time to have a look at excuse me, I've got hiccups. I'm going to give you time to have a look at the exam questions for ethics, the exam questions for types of data, and the exam questions for variables. Have a go at them if you've got some time left over, and I'll see you on Monday. Please do not forget to print out the resources that I've posted on the Google Classroom post. It was the booklet for populations and samples, and it was the booklet for measures of dispersion, and that's needed for Monday's lesson. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.